You can't forget the stories wasted for the heavyweight. No use to
Welcome to our second edition of our Fantasy Football Podcast show. We are here to provide you with a little bit more analysis on about the halfway point of the regular season. So, gentlemen, we're going to start off with taking a look back at our first show of the year. Obviously, earlier in the year, and obviously I'm joined here by Brian Christiana and Ian Kemmerer of the Nightly News. This is something that they were very adamant about doing, and something obviously I'm also a fan of. So we're taking the time to put together this show for you. As we said last time, we are basically trying to get to some of your beginning fantasy football players. This is not, you're not going to see crazy, DraftKings style analysis each week. We're really just trying to take the holistic view, and that's what we did when we first started this show, was we took a look at how to approach the draft. Now we're going to take a look again. I mentioned that we were at about the halfway point. Most fantasy football leagues have 13 weeks of regular season play, and we are through 6 weeks. So we are right at about the halfway point. We will also come back later in the term with a look before we go into the fantasy playoffs, and we'll take a little bit more look at matchups and potential boom or bust in the playoffs, but we will save that for later. Gentlemen, let's start off with talking about how your fantasy football season has been going thus far. And we'll start with you, Brian. Brian, how's your fantasy football team doing? And for the sake of reference, we're all in one league together. We should maybe just stick with that league specifically. And then if you want to talk a little bit more about some of your other leagues, feel free. So, Brian, how do you stand so far?
Well, the league that we are all currently in is the Central Penn Football Fantasy 2017. My record is 5-1. I am currently on a 5-game winning streak. My first loss, though, is, however, to Ian. So, I believe that might be his only win. But 5-1, I'll take that any day of the week, honestly.
Well, certainly Ian has more than one win. He is right now sitting at 3-3. We are in a 10-team league in which only 4 teams make the playoffs, but I will say that right now Ian is at number 5, so he's on the outside looking in at this point. Brian, any specific players that you would note maybe outperformed the value that you thought they would have at the beginning of the season?
Oh, yes, definitely. My big one for my team, actually, he had a silent start, but now I believe that the production of him will rise as a Mark Ingram. With Adrian Peterson going to Arizona recently, I believe Mark Ingram, well, let's say last game, again, well, for Mark Ingram, he had a very great game last time out, so I believe it'll step up for him.
What's interesting to me looking at your team here, Brian, is that you unfortunately had the number 1 overall pick, David Johnson, get hurt not more than, a quarter into the season?
I did not draft David Johnson.
Oh, somebody else dropped him and picked him up?
Yeah, I picked him up.
Well, that's actually very interesting because he is due back at some point this season, and with this rather deep league, that might be an interesting take there. You've got Mariota, you've got Christian McCaffrey, Mark Ingram. Now, I want to pause on Mark Ingram there for a second. Ian, will be right to you. Earlier in the year, I actually was a huge advocate and proponent of Adrian Peterson, and it's one thing I want to talk about. What is up with how the Saints used him?
Well, I think we all know that Drew Brees and the Saints offense is a pass-first offense. Mark Ingram, he is perfect for a PPR league because most of his points come on receptions. Mark Ingram gets a lot of passes, but this past week he got a lot of rushing. I think he had 1 or 2 rushing touchdowns.
25 carries, 114 yards, and 2 touchdowns. In fact, his first rushing touchdowns of the season for Mark, and his first touchdowns period of the season. So very interesting how as soon as Peterson's out of town, they get a bye, and it's the Mark Ingram show, which it's interesting to me how they handled the the Peterson situation, guys, because it didn't seem like a good fit from the beginning, but then they weren't even really giving him a shot. Ian, what's your thought process on how the Saints handled Adrian Peterson?
Adrian Peterson is a heavy running machine. Going back to the Vikings, he led the team in rushing. He was their number 1 rushing. I have Adrian Peterson, and last week he actually did pretty good for me.
He had 25 carries. He had over 100 yards and scored. It's very interesting that as soon as he found a new home, all of a sudden he's regained some of that form. Now, I wouldn't go crazy about Peterson because, remember, Arizona's offensive line very banged up. But it's certainly an interesting, for people who held on to Peterson, certainly an interesting second half play. So that was one thing. Now, Ian, let's move over to you. Now, we had already mentioned that your team is 3-3. Who are some of the people on your team that have been performing, and who are some of them that maybe have underperformed?
Okay, so my team is 3-3. I'm currently on a 2-game winning streak. The person that is performing well for me is Carson Wentz. As soon as Derek Carr went down in injury, stuck with my Philly boys and put Carson Wentz at the top. And as of right now, the past 4 games, he has given me over 10 points per game. And then the last 2 games, he's got me 20 points. So, he's a big factor on my team.
Well, he's been over 13 points in each and every game. And, in fact, the last 2 games, 27 and 21 points in our scoring. The interesting thing about Wentz, and I did want to make sure, I made a note of this, Ian. Both Brian and I gave you a hard time for where you ranked Carson Wentz.
Yes, sir.
And it seems that you were the one correct here because, to be perfectly honest with you, I don't know that there's any bigger surprise in the NFL this season than Carson Wentz from year 1 to year 2. Mm-hmm. To be honest with you guys, he has had at least 1 touchdown in every single game and has thrown for multiple touchdowns in 4 of 6, which is really exactly what you're looking for in a quarterback.
Yep.
First place in the division for the Eagles. I mean,
oh yeah.
Key game this Monday night with the Washington Redskins at home at the Link. So that should be an interesting game.
Wish I can go.
I expect Ian will be late to his classes on Tuesday.
Yes, sir.
Of course. All right, so again, some of the things that we want to chat about today, we gave a little bit off the top here. We're going to start off with our top 25, maybe how things have moved around a little bit, what injuries have taken place that have really caused some issues in fantasy. We're going to talk about the importance of handcuffing your top running backs and receivers, some surprises and second half breakout stars, potential breakout stars, and we're going to end the show with our Super Bowl predictions. And I have a feeling Ian will be saying the Eagles all the way, but we will hold on until that. All right, gentlemen, here's where I want to start with our top 25, and that's one of the places that I'd asked you to focus your attention in planning for this podcast today. So I want to go around and talk to everybody about everyone's top 5 for right now, and then we can branch out a little bit more than that. Ian, why don't you go ahead and let's hear your top 5. Now, remember, gentlemen, this is if we were having a draft today. In what order would you pick these players? I want you to think about it that way. There's a couple of guys that didn't crack my top 25 that actually, and many others, were top 10, but I just would not select them. So, Ian, can you start us off with your top 5 players?
Okay, my top 5 players are Jordan Howard from the Chicago Bears, DeMarco Murray, Antonio Brown, and Alshon Jeffries.
So, that was only 4. Who's your 5th?
Oh, and Rob Gronkowski.
Oh, Gronk, okay. Now, I'm interested when you say Alshon Jeffrey there because he hasn't really done much, to be honest with you. He is actually, and we'll talk about this later, but he's actually one of the players I noted that was extremely disappointing thus far. What is it about Alshon Jeffrey that to you think he's going to turn it around?
I think going into the rest of the season, he is what you call a top target for the Eagles. So when he's on one side of the field, that spreads out the defense and puts their best man on him. So then that opens up the other side of the field for Aguilar and Selleck Ertz for all them to get touches.
Well, that's very true, but when we're redrafting for a fantasy league, and that's sort of what's happened so far, is that he is taking their best players, putting them on one side of the field, but that means he's not getting the targets. And in fact, it's Zach Ertz who's been the biggest beneficiary of Jeffrey. Now, I'm very high on Jeffrey, and to be honest with you, he has had over 50 yards in 3 of 6 games. And he certainly has had a couple touchdowns, has not had more than 7 receptions, and in fact only has 1 game of 5 or more receptions and only 2 touchdowns, and got to go back to week 2 till he's even eclipsed 90 yards. So I'm a little surprised there with Alshon Jeffrey in your top 5, but you've proven me wrong in the past. Brian, let's hear your top 5.
Okay, I'm going to go with the obvious surprise. Well, he could even be a surprise, but Kareem Hunt from the Kansas City Chiefs, the running back, another Kansas City Chief player, and I don't think I'm wrong on this one, but Travis Kelce has been really good this season for them, along with Alex Smith. Todd Gurley from the Los Angeles Rams really has stepped up from last season. There was many questions about him. The rookie from the Jacksonville Jaguars, Leonard Fournette, has especially against Pittsburgh 2 weeks ago, he looked fantastic. And then the last one I put in is Melvin Gordon from the Los Angeles Rams. He's doing it with receiving and with rushing. So, I mean, you can't ask more from a running back.
Couple of comments there. Now, while I don't think you're far off on Kelce, putting him in the top 5, I actually have him at 22. The thing about Kelce in my mind is what has happened to the tight end position this year, gentlemen. Outside of Gronk, Kelce, and I'll even throw Ertz in there for you, Ian, I really don't think there's much else going on tight end-wise. Cameron Brate has stepped up a little bit, top 5-ish tight end. You still have guys like Delaney Walker, people like that, but guys like, O.J. Howard, who literally has like 5 catches this whole season. A lot of people were high on him. Julius Thomas from the Dolphins has been non-existent. So it's really been tough. Even got guys like Hunter Henry, who I was very high on, has 2 goose eggs this season. So to be honest, while I don't necessarily agree with you putting Kelce in the top 5, you certainly could take position scarcity into it there. My top 5 goes Kareem Hunt, so Brian and I are in agreement on the number 1 player in fantasy. Obviously, Le'Veon Bell and Antonio Brown, 2 and 3. I have Todd Gurley, number 4, Leonard Fournette, number 5. So Brian and I are pretty close. For me, Bell is the volume play here. He has had multiple games with a lot of carries. In fact, let me get some specific stats here. So basically, he's had over 25 carries 3 times, and 1 game of 32, 1 game of 35, and in that Jacksonville game, Brian, that you referenced, he had another 10 catches, has caught at least 3 balls every week. So in a PPR type scenario, Le'Veon Bell certainly has to be in your top 5. Obviously, our league, we do not play PPR, but even so, to get basically at least 20 touches every game is not something that a lot of these guys can say. All right, gentlemen, let's take a deeper look at the top 25 here in your mind, and let's move maybe outside of that top 5. Who are some other players that you have being big movers since we originally did this show back in August? Let's start off with you, Brian.
Well, before the injury, obviously Odell Beckham has to be up there. He was against the Eagles a few weeks back. He dominated in the second half. He had 2 receiving touchdowns. I know that week he had 28 fantasy points for me. I mean, the Giants, now they're 1-5. Eli Manning right now, it's rough for the Giants, but I feel like that was a great week for Odell Beckham, and I lost my number 1 receiver, and I don't know. I'm still trying to recover from that. It's tough.
And Ian?
Zach Ertz. I picked him up off of free agency for our league, and he's supposed he's gonna. I would hope that he would ump up the go in the top 2 of tight ends, being behind Kelce, but he's looking good so far for my team. He had 2 games over 90 yards, so and only had 4 touchdowns in the past 6 weeks.
I mean, Wentz is looking for him, though. And in fact, you can argue that he's their number one receiver outside of Jeffrey. Here's my concern. Kelsey, concussion. Now, it was his first concussion, and he did play last week, so it doesn't seem to be a major issue. But Gronk, I mean, you almost have to pencil Gronk in for missing another game or two, which is so unfortunate because he's a transcendent talent. Mm-hmm. But the guy can't stay on the field, or maybe they're just sort of nursing him along to try to keep him healthy. At this point, you certainly could make an argument rest of season. Zach Ertz, number one tight end, that's for sure.
Well, he leads all tight ends in receptions, so can't complain with that.
And again, Wentz is looking for him. Mm-hmm. One guy that I want to take a look at in my top 25 is absolutely Tom Brady. 13th. I have him 13th overall. I would pick him just outside of the first round. And in my mind, the quarterback, taking him that early is a little interesting. Here's my thing about Brady. With the recent Aaron Rodgers injury that we are going to talk about, now Brady is really far and away the best quarterback in football right now, certainly both in real football and in fantasy football, with all the weapons that Brady has. Now, Brady has shown his age, and in fact, the season opener against the Chiefs, he was beaten around, and to be perfectly honest, he has not had perfect games thus far. But when you look at Tom Brady's stats, and we'll take a look at those stats, he has thrown for multiple touchdowns in all but 2 games, and in both of those games that he did not throw for multiple touchdowns, he's thrown for at least 250 yards. And, outside of that Kansas City game early on, he's had at least 12 fantasy points at the quarterback position and also has, a 3-touchdown game, a 5-touchdown game, and a couple of 2-touchdown games. So, I mean, he's Tom Brady. I mean, he is what he is. But this is the thing. For me, I have Wentz pretty high in my top 25. But the thing about Wentz is he's still only in his second year. So it's really tough to let Wentz over Brady in my top 25. So that was one person I wanted to highlight there. Let's take the last look at our top 25 here, gentlemen. Let's look a little bit lower down. Let's look at maybe your second round, maybe your third round players in a 10-team league. Who are some guys that maybe in your mind you kind of were surprised that made it into your top 25? We'll start with you, Ian.
I got Jarvis Landry, number 20. Jay Cutler is more of a passer. So if you want to put Landry in the flat and more of the flex of your team, that's a good place to put him because he also gets a lot of reception yards.
Here's a couple interesting things about Landry. Definitely in a PPR league, he is an excellent choice because he's always going to catch you. Let's just say, so every week he's had a minimum of 5 catches. Going back to week 2, he had 13 catches, 6, 5, and 8. He's now caught touchdowns in 2 straight. Definitely PPR. I really like Landry. Now, here's a second thing. The other gentleman on the team, Devontae Parker, has a serious ankle injury, has missed last week, is questionable at best for this week, and I really think that Landry steps up into that deep role and maybe is not doing so much over the middle, maybe doing more down the field. So I do think that's a very interesting. And to be honest, the Dolphins are 3-2. As awful as they've looked, as pathetic as they've looked in some games, and they're still in it.
And losing their quarterback Ryan Tannehill, and then picking up Jay Cutler that came out of retirement.
I still don't understand why they did that. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me personally, but he's not looked terrible, and they're hanging into games. So,
right.
Brian, how about someone who's in your top 25 that you're kind of surprised by?
I included this one. This is actually a variety. I included you to put any Broncos wide receiver. So that includes Demaryius Thomas and mostly Emmanuel Sanders.
Well, and Emmanuel Sanders just had an injury last week, and I'm curious to see what the verdict on him is.
Can we say, honestly, that the Broncos might be one of the biggest surprises in the NFL this season? The Raiders are not doing as well as what we all thought. The Chargers aren't there. Kansas City's obviously doing what they're doing. But, I mean, Trevor Siemian, look at what he did to Dallas. He destroyed that defense, and Emmanuel Sanders and Demaryius Thomas. They just looked amazing out there.
And we'll get into this, but to be honest, when you look at the standings right now, there's really nobody out of it outside of your, Cleveland Browns, your New York Giants, maybe even a team like the Niners, the Bears. Those teams might not have too much of a chance this year. But really, when you look at everyone else, 3-3, 3-2, 3-3, 2-3. I mean, this week is huge for a lot of teams. And I think that when you look at Denver, and they're at 3-2, but their defense has been so fantastic outside of Orleans Darkwa going crazy on them last week. At this point, though, it does appear that Emmanuel Sanders is not only out for this week, that he may be out multiple weeks. How do you think that influences Brian Demaryius Thomas's value?
Oh, his stock is in a rise, and the phrase "next man up," that's going to perfectly describe the Denver Broncos wide receiver core.
Well, and the thing about Demaryius is he's pretty much a lock for 80, 1,000, and 8 touchdowns every year. But now, that's with playing with Emmanuel Sanders the last few years. I think he's looking for some big weeks if you are wanting to roll the dice on a guy, if you are playing a daily fantasy game. You could do worse than Demaryius Thomas, that's for sure. All right, one gentleman in my top 25 that I would like to give a little love to, but we'll save some of that love because I've got him in a couple of other areas, is Alvin Kamara. I, early on in the season, had a lot of good things to say. I got him in many leagues, but I got him in around the 100 area, round 10, round 11, toward the end of the draft. And this guy's just been going crazy. He's getting pretty much, a few carries every game. When Adrian Peterson's gone, he had 10 carries, 75 yards last week, but he does most of his damage through the air. He has had a minimum of 3 receptions in every game and has had a 10-reception game against Miami with a touchdown. I think in the second half, look for Alvin Kemmerer to step up and make some amazing moves. 2 New Orleans running backs in my top 25. I have Ingram at 11, and Kemmerer gets that last spot at 25. So it's very interesting, and this is why I love having you guys on, because we all have differences of opinion. And again, this is just something that we enjoy doing, so we're allowed to have a difference of opinion, and I guess that makes for part of the fun. All right, gentlemen, about halfway through the podcast, we're going to take a quick break, and we will be right back. We're going to talk injuries. We're going to talk about surprises. We're going to talk Super Bowl predictions. So we'll be right back. You're listening to Fantasy Football Advice featuring
Brian Christiana
And Ian Kemmerer.
And we are back with Brian Christiana, Ian Kemmerer. I'm Professor Paul Miller. We're here with Fantasy Football Advice. We're talking second half fantasy football. Hopefully, so far, you are doing well in your leagues. I forgot to mention, I also am 5-1 in the league, and I let you guys talk about your team, but I didn't get to talk about my team at all. I've been very fortunate with several things. All right, I got very lucky with Leonard Fournette. Michael Thomas has been a little of a disappointment. I've gotten lucky with Lamar Miller. Well, Jerick McKinnon I haven't even played yet. I picked him up. I got a couple big weeks from Stephon Diggs. Michael Thomas has been a little bit of a disappointment for me so far. And I got some usage out of Clay. I've really been mixing around and getting kind of lucky on some of my calls here. But I do think that I have a pretty solid team. Carson Palmer is playing well as well. He leads the NFL in pass attempts. It may not be pretty if you watch him, but so we have 2 5-1 teams here and a 3-3. So we're all still in it, and it looks like it could come down to the 3 of us in this league. Let's hope that we see that.
We'll see you next week.
Well, we will certainly have a full recap of our league when we come back next time. All right, 2 areas I'd like to talk about together here, guys. Injuries and handcuffs. So for handcuffs, I have a lot of people asking me, what is a handcuff? And what I want to explain about handcuffs is it is somebody on your team, the backup of a player on your team that would have serious increase in value. So now you wouldn't handcuff every running back or star wide receiver, but there are definitely some of them that you might be able to find out there right now that might be beneficial to you in the second half should something happen to one of your stud running backs or wide receivers. Let's start off with the injuries. Let's talk a couple of the major injuries thus far. And so I'm going to go to you guys. Obviously, we talked about Aaron Rodgers. Who knows what's going to happen with the Green Bay Packers losing Aaron Rodgers. I don't think any of us can really speculate on that just yet. Talked a little bit earlier about Odell Beckham. That's sort of sad. Beckham's had ankle and leg issues all year. And did you guys see that play?
Yeah, I did.
That was awful. It was gross to watch. So let's talk about some other injuries outside of the two big ones from the two first or second round guys. Who are some other injuries on your team? And of course David Johnson. We talked about him as well. Outside of those three players, who are some of the injuries that have had severe impacts on fantasy over this season? Brian?
I included Allen Robinson from the Jacksonville Jaguars. He tore his ACL week 1. That's, if you're a fantasy owner, look out for Marquise Lee from them. Allen Hurns is obvious, and we talked earlier, Leonard Fournette, he's getting the ball a lot. So Allen Robinson was a big loss, and the same with Dalvin Cook from the Minnesota Vikings. That was huge for them. Expect a lot from Jerick McKinnon and Latavius Murray, who's on the Minnesota Vikings. That was a big blow to that team.
The interesting thing about Dalvin Cook was he was having a very special season as a rookie. He had a few huge games, but now McKinnon's actually coming alive. McKinnon has had cracks of being the starting running back in Minnesota over the last 2 seasons and has not done much with the opportunity. Now, I guess in his 3rd season, he's finally getting it. Like, hey, if I don't do something here, I'm going to be out of a job. I think the biggest disappointment there is Latavius Murray. In our preseason conversation, I was extremely high on Latavius Murray, backing up Dalvin Cook, and he was the 3rd stringer most of the season. He actually did get some run after Cook's injury and really hasn't done much with it, averaging less than 4 yards a carry.
It was his job to take Jerick McKinnon, and when Dalvin Cook tore the ACL, he had a big fumble, and they put Latavius Murray right in. Don't know what's going on there, but...
The Minnesota running back situation does seem to have some more clarity, though, with Jerick McKinnon, and Murray is a clear backup. That's a good lead. It's a good segue leading us into the handcuff segment. If you own Jerick McKinnon, why not roster Latavius Murray? Something happens to McKinnon, you've got the Minnesota Vikings starting running back. Ian, what were some big injuries in your mind that have affected fantasy football thus far this season?
As we talked about before, Emmanuel Sanders, he's doubtful with the ankle injury. But also Golden Tate, he is doubtful with a shoulder injury. So there goes one of Detroit's top wide receivers.
Well, let's talk about Tate there for a second and Emmanuel Sanders. Both of those injuries look fairly serious, and the both receivers could be out multiple weeks. So I like how you took that spin on sort of current receivers or current players that are injured and could cause some issues. The one guy I wanted to bring up here, a guy that I was unbelievably high on in the preseason, especially in PPR leagues, Danny Woodhead. Danny Woodhead really didn't play more than a couple series before he had a major injury, and really still sort of unclear on what his status is going forward, although they did say early in the season that there was a outside chance that he could return. He is on IR, and there's really hasn't been much news about him, but it was very sad. Woodhead has struggled with injuries over the year, and he is on the wrong side of 30, as they say. So let's move into talking about some of these handcuffs. And again, what I mean by handcuffs is your best player. You would want to basically have their backup, maybe your top 2 players. You would want to have the backups to those people in case they would get hurt, and you can move them right into the starting lineup. Now, typically it's injury that causes this, but it also could be opportunity. And what I mean by that is in Dallas. Obviously, news has come out this week that Ezekiel Elliott should be able, unless something out of the ordinary happens over the next 2 weeks, to play until the judge returns from vacation. Isn't it crazy we're worrying about a judge's vacation when we're talking about Zeke? But here's the question. I'd say it's a pretty good chance that Zeke is suspended 6 games during this season. Who do you like in the Dallas backfield outside of Zeke? Darren McFadden or Alfred Morris?
I would personally take Derek McFadden.
Any particular reason why you would take McFadden here? He's been inactive every game this season. That doesn't mean I disagree with you.
No, it's just I don't really follow Dallas like that because they're a division rival.
I was going to say that all the more reason for you to follow him.
But, McFadden, yeah, he could be in there.
See, I like McFadden because, to me, he seems like a more complete player. Alfred Morris has never been one. Trust me, as a Washington fan, I've seen Morris. Good receiver, good find in the 7th round. Never was much to catch out of the backfield. McFadden has had several seasons with very good receptions out of the backfield. So I do like McFadden here. But I think it's 1 and 1A here. What are your thoughts on the Dallas backfield if Zeke gets suspended, Brian?
As a Dallas fan, obviously you don't want anything to happen to Ezekiel Elliott. If it happens, I'm with you. I'm with you with Darren McFadden. It was 2 seasons, though. 2 seasons on a running back is a lot, but the 1,000-yard year he had with that offensive line. But the offensive line is having a down season for them, so who knows? The rushing game with Ezekiel Elliott hasn't even been there as much this season. He had a great game the last few.
He's had a few good games this season.
But
all right, some other interesting handcuffs that I had, and then we'll go around and see if you guys are interested in any of these players. Number one is maybe a guy that some of our listeners might be unfamiliar with, James Conner, running back in Pittsburgh, and he's actually the backup to Le'Veon Bell. They don't really have much running back depth. Obviously, D'Angelo Williams has departed, no longer a Steeler. James Conner is the person to own if you own Bell. Another one that I thought has actually been somewhat surprising is Jamal Charles in, remember, Denver, backing up C.J. Anderson. If you are a C.J. Anderson owner, you should own Jamal Charles. C.J. Anderson, injury-prone, hasn't made it through a full season in a few years. Jamal Charles has looked good in limited work. Guess you don't know how much work they'd give him. But Jamal Charles, I think, would be good for at least 15 touches if something happened to C.J. Anderson. Any other people that you're looking at, guys, you might want to pick up and stash based on who your better players are in your roster, Brian?
Yeah, I have 2 of them, and they're actually both for the Detroit Lions. I included Amir Abdullah and Theo Riddick, the running backs. They both share reps. Amir Abdullah is the starter, but Theo Riddick is getting in just as much as him, so they're 2 to look at. And then we discussed earlier with Golden Tate, with him going down, look at Marvin Jones again. Marvin Jones is one of the top targets, but now his production will go up. So just keep a lookout for those fantasy owners.
Last thing I wanted to make a comment about is in New England. Now, be honest with you, we never know what the story is with New England running backs. One week, Burkhead gets 20 carries. One week, Gillislee gets 20 carries. Last week, it was Dion Lewis who had a big day after Mike Gillislee fumbled.
I just picked Dion Lewis up, actually.
And, that's a very interesting pickup because, to be honest with you, Dion Lewis has had some success over the last few weeks. Last person I wanted to mention here, John Ross, a name from the initial podcast. You got to feel bad for this guy. First NFL touch was a reverse, ran it 20 yards, fumbled, also hurt himself later in that game. Hasn't really seen the field much this season. However, the Bengals wide receiving core is banged up. John Ross is questionable this week. He may go in as the number 2 in Cincinnati if he can get on the field this week. I think John Ross is an interesting second-half breakout candidate, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. All right, gentlemen, I want to break this area up into the surprise players of the first 6 weeks, but I want to take a good and the bad, because surprise could imply good, could imply bad. So let's start with the negative. Who are some players who you have been extremely disappointed in so far this season? Ian, we'll start with you.
One of my wide receivers that I took in our draft before was Zay Jones. Zay Jones he's only had 4 receptions in the past 5 weeks. Got 1 game over 20 yards, 2 over 10, and 1 just shy of 10. He's just not putting up numbers for me like I thought he was. And to bed.
He literally only has one game with 2 catches, 3 games with 1 catch, 1 game with 0, and which is very strange because when Jordan Matthews went out with that finger injury,
Right.
They don't have anybody else, and especially Charles Clay's now out. I don't even know who Tyrod Taylor's even throwing the ball to in Buffalo, to be
I
perfectly
think he's
honest.
just running himself.
Or, just to McCoy. And I think this is a disappointment because you and I were both very high on Zay Jones. But to be honest with you, rookie receivers in this league do not have a strong track record. And John Ross, another guy. Mike Williams hasn't even gotten on the field yet in San Diego.
Corey Davis.
Corey Davis he's another guy. I'm actually holding on to Corey Davis in a couple leagues, but there's no indication he's going to be back anytime soon.
I actually just got rid of John Ross for Deion Lewis.
Well, that was the one I was implying before the show. You might want to might want to think about hanging on to Ross, but I'll actually just go out and pick him up. So thank you very much for letting me have him.
Sure.
Zay Jones was on my list of bad surprises. Brian, let's hear one of your surprises for the negative.
I included Joe Flacco. Joe Flacco, quarterback from the Baltimore Ravens. He averages 7.3 fantasy points a week. He has 4 touchdowns and 8 interceptions for the Baltimore Ravens.
And if any of you got to watch the London game where they played Jacksonville,
Oh, boy.
that might have been one of the worst football games I've ever seen a Super Bowl winning quarterback play. It was very, very disheartening. So Joe Flacco for you. I've got several, but I'm going to go with a guy on my own team, Terrell Pryor. Terrell Pryor, for me, was a top 25 guy at the beginning of the year, and he has not lived up to his fanfare. I think that from everything I hear, he's never – obviously, he was a quarterback. He's never really been outside of Cleveland, yes, the number one guy on a team, and really – he's only had one game that he was even startable, and that was at Kansas City, 3 catches, 70 yards, and a touchdown. But even last week against San Francisco, I was at the game. They weren't even looking for him.
Kirk Cousins had a great week last week, and who was it? It wasn't Jordan Reed.
It was Thompson. It was Reed. It was there were several.
Jamison Crowder.
Crowder didn't do much either last
geez.
week. So it was, there were a lot of Vernon Davis had a couple big plays.
Okay.
I think the thing in Washington is there's just so many guys to go around. Doxson's been getting some work. So I just, and this is sort of a tease for later, but I just have to believe Terrell Pryor's is bound for a second half breakout. And if you can pry him away from whoever owns him at this point, buy low, as they say, I think that now's the time to jump on Terrell Pryor. Any other, we don't have to analyze, but any other just names off the top of your head that are sort of surprises for the negative on how they've played so far?
One person on my team that I have now, Chris Hogan. He hasn't really got that many, like last week. He had 19 yards for 1 reception.
I think that you do make a good point. Rolling the dice with anybody outside of Gronk's tough in New England because they, again, same thing with Washington. They have so many different people, so many mouths to feed, as they say. And Hogan's been up and down. He's had some decent games, but last week I almost could have lost you a week with the 1 point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but you got to look at Julian Edelman. He's out, so you got Chris Hogan. You have
you got James White. You have
James White and Danny Amendola.
So, yeah, they've got 4 good receivers, 3 decent backs. They've got, obviously, Gronk. They have a huge number of people to get the ball to.
Mm-hmm. I want to bring this one up. I think that there's been videos out. Matt Ryan is the biggest bust in fantasy football this season. I can bring this up. He only has 6 touchdowns this season, and he hasn't scored over 20 fantasy points.
I think that's interesting about Matt Ryan. To me, he's at least thrown for 240 and a touchdown. He's not. There was 1 week that he played poorly against Buffalo, but he's not really losing you weeks. He's just probably not giving you the value of where you drafted him. I just looking at his numbers, he's had 1 300-yard game, 1 2-touchdown game. But really, to me, it's not like it's horrible, but I suppose where you drafted him, it probably was.
Right.
All right, so just a couple of other people that I noted here. Again, we won't go into too much detail, but Amari Cooper,
dropping the ball.
Huge disappointment. Absolutely huge. Now, I was fortunate. I don't have him in any of my leagues. Here's another Deshaun Kaiser. I was extremely high on him. Now, they did mention that he is going to take the number 1 quarterback spot for Cleveland, but he has not looked good.
Yeah. I traded him in my other league to get Mike Glennon, who is not even starting no more. And then I had to pick up Kevin Hogan. And he didn't. Let's not get into that.
Yeah. If you're starting a Browns quarterback, you might as well just forget it. Here's another guy. We'd mentioned Crowder. Crowder is a big disappointment. 1,000 yards last year. Hasn't had more than 50 yards in a game this year. And last, Martavis Bryant. He was a guy I was high on in several leagues. He's just, I don't know, it's the whole Steelers offense. Maybe Bell's getting a lot of touches. Bryant had one big game, but for the most part, he's just average. And Juju Smith-Schuster from USC, the first-round pick, is actually beating him in snaps. So maybe it's time to cut bait on Martavis Bryant. All right, last segment before we get to our Super Bowl predictions, gentlemen. I want you to pick one person who you believe is going to have a huge second half and outperform their first half stats. So we'll start with Brian. Brian, who do you have?
This was a tough segment, but I went with Evan Ingram, tight end from the New York Giants.
Now, I think that Ingram is an excellent pick because who else are they going to throw to? No Beckham.
Nobody.
No Marshall. Shepard's questionable. They're pulling guys off the street to play wide receiver, and at least Evan Ingram, while a rookie, he's definitely looked good thus far. Ian, second half breakout player.
It was a tough decision, but I have faith in this person, Marshawn Lynch. I think he's gonna, as soon after Kansas City game, they got Buffalo and Miami. They're both away, and then you got the bye week, and then you got New England. I think that he's gonna have a lot more fantasy points in rushing and receiving. And I'm looking at his things right now. He's only had 2 rushing touchdowns in a matter of 6 weeks. So, I've been holding on to him, and I think he's going to be a standout in the next. He's going to turn around and come in for me.
As far as Lynch goes, I don't think it's that he's playing poorly. I think that the whole team really has been playing poorly. The offensive line hasn't delivered, but he's been unscathed so far. It seems to me that they expect to be a playoff team. They want him fresh. He hasn't had, outside of week 1, he hasn't had more than 13 carries in a game. That was last week. And he is playing well. I did have Marshawn Lynch on my second half breakout. I think that there's some opportunity. However, they do have Denver. They do have Kansas City in the second half, 2 of the toughest run defenses in the league. But I still am holding out hope for Marshawn Lynch, and again, I do have him on my breakout list.
And then you gotta understand Derek Carr is just coming back off of a back injury, so
He shouldn't even be back yet. That's
Right.
the thing.
no. But when your team is down, the only backup quarterback that they have is EJ Manuel, and he's not looking good neither.
The unfortunate thing is right now the Raiders are 2-4, and I really hope they show up this week because, it gets later in the season. Maybe Marshawn Lynch is on the bench. Maybe they're trying to take a look at guys for next year because remember, Marshawn Lynch is only under a 1-year contract. Who's to say if he comes back? Maybe they trade him. I mean, look at what just happened to Adrian Peterson. If they could get somebody else, because they have, in Oakland, they have a couple of younger backs on the team.
Bring him to the Eagles.
Well, but they have already got LeGarrette Blount, who I actually think is surprising. I'm surprised how they used him, but they've been using him better lately. One guy I wanted to mention for as far as the second half breakout, I did mention Terrell Pryor earlier. I agree with Marshawn Lynch, but I got to go back to Alvin Kamara. I think in a PPR league, you're talking about a potential top 10 running back, and for where you got him, hopefully you held on to him. I think Kamara looks to be potentially a fantasy MVP in PPR leagues, and certainly a running back too in non-PPR. Also keep an eye out, John Ross, and of course, the resurgent Adrian Peterson. All right, now, to our final segment. We're going to step outside of fantasy, and we're going to talk about our Super Bowl predictions. Now, gentlemen, what I did was, at this point in the season, it's awfully tough. So what I did was I picked the NFC Championship game. I picked the top 2 NFC teams. I picked the top 2 AFC teams, and then we'll go from there. So, Ian, we're going to start with you. Who do you have coming out of the NFC, or who are your NFC title game predictions?
Coming out of the NFC, of course, I got to rep with my Eagles. 5-1, top of the division right now. I also can say probably New Orleans is definitely in for the wild card. Yeah, so I think the Eagles and New Orleans will be in the division game. My AFC is going to be Kansas City and New England again.
That sounds very interesting. All right, we're going to move to Brian, and we'll come back to your Super Bowl pick here in just a minute. Who do you have in the AFC, NFC title games, Brian?
All right, the NFC, I actually put Seattle in there, and I see them going up against Atlanta.
Atlanta, they've had a tough go of it. They are sitting at 3-2, but they are 1-2 at home in their brand new immaculate stadium. So interesting pick there, but they certainly have all the pieces that they can rebound. How about the AFC?
I went the same route as Ian. I mean, there's two obvious teams. I mean, record might not show it, but you can't go against Tom Brady. He's the greatest of all time. You just can't go against the man. And then Kansas City, what they're doing is looking great. I'd like to give a shout-out to the general manager of the Kansas City Chiefs from Mount Carmel, Mr. Veach. Great job of what you're doing. Kansas City, I just don't see them losing. So,
well, I'll tell you what, there's one thing we can agree on here. I do also have the Eagles and the Saints as same as Ian. I think that the Saints have really turned the corner. They hit their bye at the right time. They got Peterson out of there. Hopefully got something back from him, I think a conditional pick. But I think between Ingram, Kemmerer, Breeze, Michael Thomas, their defense is playing well. I believe their defense had 3 touchdowns last week because that's always been their Achilles heel. But they are sitting at 3-2 right now, New Orleans, and they're just a half a game back of the Panthers. You want to talk about another tough division. Panthers at 4-2, Saints and Falcons at 3-2, Tampa Bay at 2-3. So that's going to be a tough division. I also like your Seattle pick, Brian. Seattle, still good. They still have a lot of those guys, Legion of Boom. They've got a lot of experience in the playoffs. And let's be honest, the Niners are out of it. The Rams are 4-2, which, hey, they're a surprise team. Let's not undersell them. And the Cardinals are at an ugly 3-3. They've had some really bad games, including against the Eagles. In my AFC, of course, I believe we're going to sweep that. Patriots and Chiefs. Steelers are very up and down. I don't really trust anybody coming out of the AFC South. And the only team that I would throw in there right now is Denver. Their Denver defense, the way they've bottled up running backs outside of, again, Orleans Darkwa last week, that showing just didn't sit right with me against the Giants last week. Off the bye, at home, Denver they got crushed, and to a team with no wins. I mean, did you guys get to watch any of that game?
Yeah, I did. I stopped watching third quarter.
It was very surprising to me what happened in that game. And hopefully Denver uses that as a wake-up call, so I think that they could give Kansas City a run for their money. But like you said, Brian, New England, they're still getting it done, even without a whole lot of defense. Kansas City looking good.
I do want to point out some in the AFC. I'm looking at it's going to be a close race. It's not always going to be just New England and Kansas City, but I'm looking at Jacksonville Jaguars. They might actually come up in the playoffs and probably
and they're tied for the lead right now with the Tennessee and with Houston and with Indy still in it, only a game out. So that's very interesting. All right, now who do we have in the Super Bowl? Ian.
It's tough. So from out of the AFC, I'm gonna go with Kansas City. I think that I don't doubt Tom Brady, but Alex Smith is doing a hell of a job this season, and I actually think that going forward and to the playoffs, he's going to do good. And then the NFC, still repping the Eagles. Eagles.
If they were 0-6, they'd probably be your Super Bowl prediction.
No. I would have said somebody else, but
No, they look great. I got to give it to you. They have a good run game. They haven't had too many injuries this year. I know Smallwood's missed a game or two, but
Sproles is out.
Sproles, yeah, and that was very disappointing. It's sad to see that. 2 major injuries on one play.
Yeah, but he's actually coming to the end.
Yeah, I know. It's just sad to see somebody like that go.
Yeah,
out
this
that
is
way.
the last season for Darren Sproles. He has announced. This is it.
I thought he said he was still interested in maybe coming back. Who knows? There remains to be seen.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll find out more news for next time. Brian, who do you have in the Super Bowl?
This is a repeat of a few years back. I went with New England versus Seattle, and with New England winning again.
And I'm going to say the Eagles and the New England Patriots. And again, how can you bet against Tom Brady? As they say, you don't get rich betting against Tom Brady.
You going back into 2004?
I am.
Eagles in New England?
Yes, yes.
Tom Brady versus Donovan McNabb?
Wentz was in high school or in middle school back then. So, actually, he would have been in middle school. If it's 04, that's 13 years ago. How old is he? 23?
23.
Yeah, so he'd have been in elementary school for that. So, to be honest, and I'm a big Washington fan, I would have put Washington in that NFC title game, except for the fact that because they play in the same division, that's really not even possible. It really remains to be seen, though, Ian, what happens this Monday night. If Washington goes into Philly and wins that game, I think things change, and maybe Washington's up at the top. But all right, gentlemen, we have our Super Bowl picks locked in. It's been a pleasure, as always. We get to get out of here for the day, but we will come back before the fantasy playoffs start, and give you one final look at our thoughts about the fantasy football playoffs. All right, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today. It was a pleasure to have you.
Thank you again.
No problem. And I just want to say Eagles are going to beat the Washington Redskins.
We will see what happens, my friend. We will see what happens. All right. Until next time, this is Professor Paul Miller, and with Brian Christiana and Ian Kemmerer from the Nightly News. And we'll catch you again next time on Fantasy Football Analysis.
You